Well, good morning. Thank y'all for being here today. Like I said, with it being a holiday weekend, lots of people are traveling, but I truly believe that God has in this room who He needs to be here today. And so I celebrate that this morning as we opened up Scripture together. We're continuing in our story of David, the life of David. We have been talking about the life of what would become King David and the path that it took to get there. And so far, we've covered 3 weeks so far. And so with the first week, we talked about David being anointed king. So as we know, Saul had already kind of turned away from the Lord, and so the Lord knew that his time as king was not going to continue on to the next generation. And so David was appointed king, and of course it comes through a test of casting lots, and then of course pointing Samuel to the family of Jesse. And as Jesse presents all of his sons and the 7 older brothers, God says no, and finally David is presented and is made king, anointed as king of Israel before his entire family, including his 7 older brothers. And then week 2, we talked about how David then stepped into the house of royalty, not as royalty himself, but as a worship leader, essentially, for King Saul. As King Saul had turned away from the Lord, it tells us, had allowed for a spirit to come into the life of Samuel, or into the life of Saul, and because of that, he was tormented and he was tortured. And one of the servants said, well, I know this guy that is a fantastic worship leader. He plays a heck of a layer. And why don't we bring him in? And he can lead you into worship and soothe your soul. And so David steps into the presence of King Saul and assumes his first role within the royalty. And then last week, we talked about the big story, the one that we all know, David and Goliath, and how David was sent to take merchandise to the family and to his brothers, and in the process he hears Goliath calling out Israel, and David stands against it. And so as David, of course, he goes out and he slays the giant of Goliath, and it tells us that he then proceeds to take the head of Goliath back to the kingdom, and so everybody is able to celebrate the death of the one that stood against Israel. And again, we talked about it wasn't the fact that David did it for David's benefit, that David did it so that people would celebrate David, but he did it because that's what God had led him to do. He did it because this man stood against the God of Israel. And so as David goes in and takes care of the giant, a celebration erupts. And that's where we find ourselves today. In 1 Samuel starting in chapter 18, we're going to cover most of chapter 18 and 19. And we're going to do it kind of quickly because there's lots to cover here. But again, we have this celebration. We have this moment that David is taking out the giant, and everyone begins to celebrate. And at the end, it tells us that Saul asked, "Who is this man that has conquered the giant?" And of course, again, there's a couple different reasons why Saul might not have recognized him, whether it was the spirit of torment had literally drove him insane to where he didn't know David, or when David was in his presence, he was behind a curtain and separated from Saul to where Saul never really knew David's face. But so he speaks to David, and David answers at the end of chapter 17, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." And so that's where we end last week, and we pick up here in chapter 18, starting in verse 1. And it tells us this. It says, "As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul," speaking of David, "the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own." So if you haven't caught this so far, Jonathan is the oldest son of King Saul. Jonathan is what should be the heir to the throne. Jonathan is about David's age, maybe a few years older. They think within about 4 or 5 years older than David, but they were very similar. But it tells us that Jonathan knit his soul to David's, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. So before he would bring David in, and David would play the lyre, and he would bring him into this moment of worship and then would send him away, but no longer. He would take him and not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful everywhere Saul sent him, so that Saul set him all over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So here we have this moment where Jonathan has attached himself onto David. And I really think that this is a very beautiful moment because, again, Jonathan was the heir apparent to the throne. Jonathan was the one who should be king next. But because what we know about Jonathan and we know about Jonathan's heart, he was close with the Lord. He knew the Lord intimately. And so we can kind of make the conclusion that maybe Jonathan knew, maybe not that David was going to be the next king, but there was something special about him. There was something significant about David to the point where he would remove his own heir and give it to David. He would remove his own clothing, the clothing of the next king of Israel, and give it over to David. And it tells us that whenever this happened, that David would then go out and would conquer everything that stood in his midst. But then we have another moment. Moving on in verse 6. It says, as they were coming home, of course, from conquering and taking down everybody that stood in their way, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, women came out of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And of course, as we know about Saul, and Saul was very angry, and this displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? Little foreshadowing there. And Saul eyed David from that day on. He was angry. He was already an angry man. We already know this about Saul, that he was already an angry man. But this was a pride issue. This hurt his innermost being. How dare they say he took down 10,000 and me only 1,000? The only thing left for him to take from me is my kingdom. Continues on, verse 10, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David played the lyre, as he did day by day, and Saul had his spear in hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Have you ever had a bad day at work? Just remember this story the next time you have a bad day at work. Your boss isn't trying to pin you to the wall with a spear. It might be a bad day, but not quite that bad. And Saul was afraid, verse 12, of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And Saul removed him from his presence, and made him commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul had saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. He was the man. He walked with the Lord. He was humble. He was a great warrior. They loved David. And of course, that just continued to hurt Saul's soul. But it tells us this, we continue on, so of course, as David had approached the group that was there to fight Goliath, he had asked, what is to be made of the man that conquers this Philistine? And they tell him, you're going to be tax exempt for the rest of your life, and you're going to have all of these treasures, and you're going to get to marry the king's daughter. So here we have that moment. Verse 17, then Saul said to David, here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. Maybe if I send him into battle, they'll kill him for me. And David said to Saul, who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Melahathite, for a wife. So the promise that was given to David was then given to somebody else, but that's okay because it continues on and says, now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and this pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David for a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. Again, this is another trap. Maybe if I make him so busy with a wife and with a family and with the thought of returning home that maybe they'll still kill him for me. But that didn't work either. It says, and Saul's servant spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, does it seem to you... This wind is blowing. I know it's bothering Tyler during worship too. Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? And the servant of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemy. And now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when he told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before time had expired, David arose and went along with his men and killed 200 Philistines. And David brought back their foreskins, which were given in a full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter for a wife. But when Saul saw, and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. He gives him this huge task. Go and conquer these Philistines and bring me the proof. And he said, you know what? I'll double it. I want to be your son-in-law. I want to marry your daughter, that I'm going to double it. And Saul was even more afraid of David. And so this would continue. His hatred towards David, his frustration towards David, his anger towards David would continue from then all out. You would think that he would take a moment and go, he's done everything I've asked of him. He's only ever been good to me. He's never done anything to me. But he was still angry. Verse 30 tells us, then the commanders of the Philistine came out of battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed. He just kept getting more notoriety and more notoriety, to the point where it would drive Saul literally mad. So now we have the stage is set. We have an angry king. We have his new son-in-law that has done literally everything right. But yet he's still angry. So chapter 19, we pick up with the same story. It continues on, and Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all of his servants, that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself, and I will go out and stand before my father in a field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all of these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. Sometimes we need people like this to speak truth into us. And sometimes it comes in the most unusual way possible. For Saul, for the king of Israel, for one of the mightiest men in all of the area, it was his own son. And I have a great relationship with my father, and sometimes there's times that I want to speak truth to him. But this could have cost Jonathan his life. This could have cost Jonathan everything. But even then, he still stood on the truth of who David was and who God was. This man has done nothing but good for you. This man has went out of his way to not only conquer the enemy that stood before you, that was your responsibility, but now here he is, continuing to do good for you, continuing to do well, and never once has sinned against you. And finally, some sense started to work into Saul's mind. Maybe, just maybe, if I bring him back into my presence, will be good. But unfortunately, that's not how it works out. Verse 8, and there was a war again. And David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a great blow, so that they fled before him. Then, once again, a harmful spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. And David was playing the lyre, and Saul sought to pin David against the wall with a spear, but he eluded Saul, so that he struck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. Once again, we have this moment of Saul's brain was literally going mad. This man had been brought back into his presence, and he had once again done exactly what he was called to do. He once again did exactly what the Lord had called him to do, and exactly what Saul had asked of him. And he steps back into Saul's presence, and Saul tries to kill him once again. Just a few more verses, I promise. Stick with me here. We're going to finish out through verse 17. It says, and Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair as its head and covered it with its clothes. We see this in cartoons sometimes where they kind of make a fake person. They're sleeping, I promise. So she does the same thing, and when Saul sent messengers to David, she said, he is sick. Then Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with a pillow of goat hair as its head. And Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? So she covers for David, but covers for David in a way that it also covers for herself. She had told him, you need to flee, you need to go. He is going to kill you. And yet here's this moment where now she's being questioned about it, and she goes, he was going to kill me if I didn't let him go. Not only saving David's life, but then saving her own life as well. And we have this moment of Saul's own children have now turned against him. Saul's own flesh and blood has turned against him because he was not walking with the Lord. His mind had turned against him because he was no longer walking with the Lord. And it continues on, and of course David then flees, and he gets way away, and he meets back with Samuel and spends some time with Samuel and spends time recharging and revitalizing himself, but he continues to run. And we're going to pick back up on this story here in a couple chapters next week, and we're going to finish out where this plot takes us, but at the moment I want us to focus on a few things here. And there are three things that I want us to think about as we think about this story of David. We think about these two chapters as they're paired together. And I truly believe there's three things that we can take with us. And first is this: trust in the Lord. And of course, Scripture is always going to point us to trust in the Lord. But this story continues to tell us exactly that. Because if I'm David, if I'm in this moment where my boss tried to kill me twice, and then he sends me out to go and battle with hundreds of Philistines, and then invites me back into his home, I'm going to have a hard time returning. I'd have a very hard time returning. It tells us that he tried to kill David twice, and he still came back, and he tried to kill him for a third time. This is a trust in the Lord that I pray that we all carry with us no matter what. Because again, in my fleshly spirit, I truly believe that if somebody's trying to kill me, I'm not going to keep returning to their presence. Especially knowing that he already runs around the house carrying his spear like a crazy person. I'm not going to then return into his presence. But it tells us that David does exactly that. David continues to trust in the Lord no matter what. He trusts in the Lord with his own life. He trusts in the Lord when he goes out into battle with thousands of other lives following him. He trusted in the Lord when he stepped foot on the battlefield against Goliath by himself. David trusted in the Lord. And of course, because of that, we get this moment where he is now appointed the king of Israel because God already knew his heart. God knew that he trusted in him. And that this would not vary, this would not vary at any point. This would not wear away, that this was a man who truly trusted in the Lord. I want us to carry a faith like that no matter what situation we're stepping into, whether we're comfortable or uncomfortable, when we go to share our faith or we go to share our lives with somebody else, that it doesn't matter what's going to come or go or what's going to come on to us because we trust in the Lord. I want to trust in the Lord to the point where even if somebody's trying to kill me, I still take that step out. And that is terrifying to think of now, but we can get to this point of faith in the Lord. Because he has not failed us yet, he will never fail us, and David knew that from day one. The life of David shows us that we need to trust in the Lord in whatever we do. The second thing the story shows us is that we should stand in strong character. Stand strong in character. This goes for David, this goes for Jonathan, this goes for Michael, this goes for all of them. Because it takes true character to not respond hatefully. Because David, he already knew that he could conquer and kill whatever he wanted. But he also knew that Saul was an appointed king of the Lord. And his character didn't waver no matter what. His character didn't waver when this guy was trying to pin him to a wall and kill him. Stand strong in your character. We know what we are supposed to do. As believers in Jesus Christ, as we have come into a relationship with him, as we've spent time in Scripture, we have spent time learning the lives of all these different people throughout the history of our faith. We know the character of God. We know the character of those who loved the Lord faithfully. Stand strong in your character, because there is going to be time and time again where people or situations come where we want to step out of our character, where we want to step out of our Christianity for a moment. We want to step out of our positivity for a moment. I think back to this again, and if my boss tried to kill me 3 different times, I would have a very hard time responding in a positive manner. Honestly, we're probably to the point where if I had a boss yell at me 3 times, I'd have a hard time responding in a positive manner. Or if I had a coworker yell at me 3 times or get upset with me 3 times, or if I had somebody else within my life do this to me, how would we stand in our character? Just like David, we have to pursue the heart of the Lord time and time again, because we are called to something bigger and better than what those around us are called to. And again, it's not an us against them type of mentality, but it is a putting our character, putting our beliefs at the forefront of everything that we do. Because like David, we should take a stand against. And whether that means removing ourselves from the situation like David does here, or standing up against the situation. But that's when trusting in the Lord comes into place. That's when following the Lord comes into place. I can stand in my character because I know that I can then go to the Lord and say, God, what do you want me to do? How do I respond in this moment? What words do I use in this moment? I might be frustrated, angry, hurt. But how do I respond in this moment? How do I still stand in who you are? Even though I would very much like to blow up or flip tables or get angry or whatever it is. How do I continue to stand in the character of the Lord, even at my hardest challenges, even at my most frustrating moments? How do I stand in your character? And lastly, and this is a big one, and this is one I talk about often, and I love the fact that our young ones are in here with us today, because this is important for me as an adult, this is important for our children, this is important for every one of us. Careful who you surround yourselves with. And I had to kind of cut it down for it to work correctly, but be careful who you surround yourself with. Be careful who you allow to speak life into you. Be careful who you allow to persuade you or to push you or to lead you. Because David could have stepped into this moment with Saul and saw how he reacted to things and been like, that's the guy I'm going to follow. But instead, he had friends like Jonathan, and he had a wife like Michal that would continue to support him and love him and be there with him no matter what. Be careful who you surround yourself with, because who you surround yourself with will cause great issues in your life or will cause great blessings in your life. And for our young ones, for our little ones here, it is so important who you choose to be friends with now. Because the older you get and the more that they speak into your life, the more they can either guide you towards good or guide you away from good. And it's the same thing with us as adults. There are some people that if I allowed them to speak into my life, then I would not live a life that God has called me to live. In fact, when I was an adult and I allowed for people to speak into my life that did not know the Lord or did not recognize my faith the way that I did, they guided me down paths that were not what God had in for me. We need to be careful who we surround ourselves with. Surround yourself with somebody like Jonathan, somebody who loves the Lord and who will literally love you as their own. A wife like Michal who was there for you no matter what. But we are to be careful who we surround ourselves with. That is why it is so important what we do here. Because here we can come together with a community that truly loves the Lord and is truly pursuing what the Lord has called us to do. And we can do that as a community. I love this church because this church has surrounded me and my family and has come together to love on me and my family. And as we break it down even more, as we talk about our Bible study groups and how our Bible study groups have come together, our small group and how our small group comes together. We have a Facebook group that our small group communicates in, and typically it's, what potluck we're going to do this week, or it's, if we have to cancel, we can cancel within this group. And last night it became a theological question at 10 o'clock, and Jackson doesn't go here anymore. They moved to Las Vegas, and so I can pick on him a little bit. He messaged us at 9:45 last night. How dare he do that? Got me up, got me thinking. I was almost asleep, and my wife was like, "You going to respond?" I'm like, "I guess." But it was a great conversation because we have this community that wants better for each other. We have this community that wants to grow together. And that's not the first time a theological question has been thrown out like this. It happens every few weeks, maybe once a month. It happens a lot. The same thing happens with our staff, with our leadership here at the church, where we can come together and we can love on one another and we can spend time with one another. We can help each other grow. We can surround ourselves with people that have a like mindset like us. Not to just reaffirm what we believe or what we are, but to help us grow. Of course, Proverbs tells us that iron sharpens iron just as one man sharpens another. And that also means not only is it sharpening, but it is removing the extra that doesn't need to be there. We can come together and I can help you remove some things in your life, and you can help me remove some things in my life, and we can grow stronger together. We need to be careful who we allow to speak into our lives. And I'm so thankful for this church and for this community that we've built here, that we can speak into one another's lives. We can speak into one another children's lives as well. That you can speak kindness and goodness into my children, that we can do the same. And that we can grow literally as a family here at Highland. But even outside of these walls, be careful who you surround yourself with. Because those who we surround ourselves with can either lead us to blessing or lead us to death. And I know that there are probably some of you here today that are thinking, man, if I would have known this, if I would have thought of this years ago, I could have avoided hurt. I understand. But again, God has brought you here today so that we can look at today and go, moving forward, how can I be better? How can I take the story in the life of David and apply it to who I am today to both better myself and to further the kingdom of God? Because the best way that we can continue to pursue the Great Commission and we can continue to present Jesus to this world is if we are right with the Lord and we are right within ourselves.